All right, so here we are. We're talking about the last subheading of the global problems heading. So we're talking about coping with global problems, international organizations. So within the past couple hundred years, especially last 100 year, we've seen the increase in this new type of organization. It's called a non-governmental organization, and they're crucial because states want to keep their sovereignty, but there are problems they have to face which go across their borders. And especially if you're not a major country, they can be nearly impossible for you to make any sort of headway on. So the first NGO, quote unquote, first, but the real prototype, the big example that we use for an NGO is the Red Cross, which was created by a Swiss philanthropist at first, but because of the issues of wartime. The purpose of war is to kill people. But what do you do about the wounded? What do you do about like prisoners of war? What do you do about like medical personnel? And so what the Red Cross was trying to do is, well, how do we, yeah, once you've shot someone, um, shouldn't they be out? If they're not going to be able to fire at you, shouldn't they be able to get medical help? And so what they were seeking to do is to kind of create, with the Geneva Convention, um, create these ground rules. And again, this is 1864. This is before even the world wars. The warfare that had been happening in Europe between the different countries and within the different countries necessitated this idea of trying to think about it. And it's become an international organization. It's often called sometimes it's called the Red Crescent in some Muslim countries where a cross is just seen as totally offensive. But the mission is still the same. They created like this convention, kind of like this idea of like, hey, these are at least the ground rules. I mean, there's no rules in love and war, but here's some like rules for like civilians, for people who are or hospitals, so on and so forth. And so again, they aren't always followed, but they're at least there. And originally, the Red Cross was just made for wartime, but it's also moved into peacetime. It's gone into helping relieve human suffering. So often when there is a natural disaster, usually the Red Cross is able to organize things to help prevent human suffering and to help people who desperately need it. Another another organization which is really important, since this chapter talks so much about environmental issues, is Greenpeace, which was founded in 1970, and it's dedicated to the preservation of rich natural resources and diverse animal and plant life. And so they gained a lot of notoriety and fame based off of some of the things that they would do. And one of the reasons that some people found them, especially back then, controversial is that they were one of the first NGOs to really understand the importance of the media. And so they would create these kind of visual spectacles to try to get their point across. So they were most famous at first for things like trying to disrupt whaling expeditions, very dangerous and not smart, and other animal and natural rights, doing big things to try to prevent those things from those natural resources or animals to be destroyed. Um, the biggest organization, which you need to know, is the United Nations, which basically took the place of the League of Nations after the Second World War. And the important thing to note about the United Nations is they do not legislate. Um, they are a place to meet where you know all countries in the world can get together and kind of meet together and try to work out these international problems. But especially with what happened with the League of Nations, they realized that they can't really, you can't force countries to follow your rules. The country has to buy in to do so. And the representative of the United Nations is obviously not as important as the leader of that country. And where they've shined isn't necessarily, even though their point is to maintain international peace and security, there clearly have been wars since they've started. And fortunately, to this day, there's still wars that sometimes pop up between countries, but they tend to be within countries now. And so the place where they really shine, though, is is in helping uh, international cooperation, or being a place to facilitate international cooperation solve international problems, be it economic, social, or cultural. So they've they basically have helped to eradicate smallpox. They have helped to decrease child mortality rates. They've helped to increase female literacy. And at this point, the United Nations, interestingly, at the turn of the millennia, they created things called Millennium Goals, which from 2000 to 2015 really kind of focused. I was either on 7 or 8 goals to help really the poorest of the poor. And while it didn't eradicate it, they made a huge leap in lowering that. So they were encouraged by that. They've created things called Sustainable Development Goals. Again, you can take AP Human Geography and learn a lot more about that. So that's the United Nations. Now, a real thing that, again, probably seems weird to you, but is a relatively new thing, is an international preoccupation with human rights. And, again, this you can intellectually, you go back to like Greco-Roman natural laws, and you can look into what happened in Western Europe and then with the United States. And it's important to know, it's very important, even though your book doesn't say it, it's very important to note that those always start off with, hey, us rich people on top want to be seen as equal and can't be pushed around by authoritarian leaders. However, there's it's a very contagious idea. It's an idea that that many people believe, at least on some level in their heart, that everybody, just by being human, you're equal. And in World War II, we especially, this really started to go to the forefront because of the unfortunate, horrible things that the Nazis did to Jews, to the Roma, to people that they thought were less than human and deserved to be exterminated. And so that's where we first started to really hear this idea of this crimes against humanity. So the idea is that the UN has created different things about trying to create this universal respect for human rights, for fundamental freedoms for people across the planet. And so some of the things that they're trying to get rid of are things like extrajudicial or summary executions, basically authoritarians just killing people without due process or without some sort of adjudicated reason. Things like getting rid of things like torture, getting rid of things like slavery or discrimination based on someone's race or sexual, gender or orientation on religious grounds. So the orientation is relatively new, but we're starting to see that. We're starting to see that in different places, and some people are definitely pushing for those things to be included. Now, some of the groups which are really important regarding human rights is Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch, which try to bring to spot the places where these things aren't being followed, to try to put pressure from the international community and to say this is no, and for states to do things about it. For instance, we talked last chapter about South Africa, and that was a case of with apartheid. Countries used to just do whatever they wanted within their borders, and as other countries were struck by the clear discrimination that was a part of apartheid, countries stopped doing business with them. And so there is, fortunately, a push to kind of recognize human rights regardless of who those people are. And honestly, I hope you join them in that. We're going, not perfect. Definitely, we definitely have some people going in the right direction, and that's what Ms. Hadi and I are hoping, is that you join along those people and help move us farther and faster to make things more equal for all people.